So it's 2:30 by my clock, so we'll get started with the second panel so that we have time to plumb the depths of this rich and really important topic. The second panel will focus on preserving the memory of institutions, sites of conscience, places of remembrance. With the closure of all state institutions for persons with significant disabilities finally in sight, well, you know, I guess, advocates are discussing how to conserve and interpret for the public the reality of the institution as the epicenter of the civil rights movement for people with complex support needs. This panel will discuss the grassroots initiative to establish a National Museum of Disability History and Culture, as well as explore how best to capture the experience of institutionalization and liberation from institutions and places of remembrance. Judith Gran will be the moderator of this really important panel. And Judith, take us away.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a really great panel. Our first speaker will be Jim Conroy, who is the president of the Center for Outcome Analysis, co-president of the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, and the leader, I would say, in the effort to establish a National Museum of Disability and Culture. Most of you are very familiar with Jim's work, which consists primarily of quantitative studies of the outcomes for people with disability of different kinds of living arrangements and service configurations. And he has done probably more to influence the movement from institutions to community than almost anyone, because his research has shown the benefits. So now he's focused on creating memorials to the experience of institutionalization and other aspects of the disability experience. We'll hear from Dr. Catherine Ott, who is currently serving as an advisor at the National History, the Natural History Museum. No,
I'm a curator at the American History Museum.
American History Museum.
At the Smithsonian.
I used to live in New York City, and there's a Museum of Natural History there that is all I can think of. And Dr. Ott has had a rich career as a curator and historian in the Division of Medicine and Science at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And she has done groundbreaking work in the history of the body and the relationship between material culture and technology and disability. And you will hear from Kate Jurek, Dr. Kate Jurek, who is a scholar of the history of institutions. And Kate is herself a survivor of institutionalization. She was institutionalized for many years as a child. And her journey from the institution to getting her doctorate at the University of Minnesota has been quite amazing. So with that, we'll begin with Jim Conroy.
Thank you, Judy, and thanks to TASH, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be in the most realistic Zoom I've been in at least 5 years. It feels like we're in the very same room. Okay, we made it through the pandemic. This is about gleaning meaning and memorial and memory from our fairly difficult past. My outline is 4 points. First, after 50 years, institutions for people with intellectual disability are almost gone, and that was a great success. One of the greatest of the 20th century, but that was only one disability group. And I particularly enjoyed the last presentation about combining disability groups because that's only one. In mental illness, we did disastrous things in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so that point needs to stay in our minds. Like other human atrocities, we can't let ourselves forget what happened. So memory is crucial. And a lot of people have concluded the nation needs a place of memory, just like the other great civil rights movements. And this place, like more so than any other of these places, has to be a cyber place. Has to be a place where people can come and visit, even if they can't get on an airplane and a train and so forth. So it's got to be unique. This is a word about my start in 1970. I lived out in Bethesda. I got out of college. I got a weird job in a consulting firm in Bethesda. And it was a study of the Developmental Disabilities Act, 1970. My first draw in a random sample was Pennhurst, a notorious institution. And I drove up in my father's blue Chevy and drove home crying, and that changed my life. So I'm here 54 years later, still devoted to one thing. This country should never have done that, and it should completely stop. Back in that time, 1968, there was an expose about the Pennhurst Center in Pennsylvania called Suffered Little Children. And in it, Bill Baldini, the news person, mentioned that the cost of keeping a leopard in the Philadelphia Zoo was more than the cost of keeping a human being at Pennhurst. That's where we came from. So in half a century, we really have come a long way, but where we started was dismal. And this is what I saw when I walked into Pennhurst, a ward with nobody with anything to do, unstimulated. And there were 2 people behind a glass wall in a room full of 50 men. What can you do? It wasn't the staff's fault, but that's where we began. Now, this graph shows in green the rise of institutional settings for people with developmental disability. And it rose and rose, it really rose for 100 years. And then in about 1970, it started to decrease. So you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, a decrease in the number of Americans in public institutions for people with developmental disabilities. On the right, in red, is the growth of our community support system, which was spurred immensely by the allowance of federal money to be spent in community settings, not just institutions, which that began in about 1981. This is a graph of the whole century and a half, putting people in institutions. This graph shows a climb from about 1850 up to 1970 and now down, and it's gone down so far that it's near zero. About under 15,000 people from a peak of about 200,000. Now it's worth, in fact, it's crucial with this group to point out most of our progress came from institutional litigation. There were exposés throughout the 20th century. There are Life magazine stories. Nothing happened. But when that TV show hit in 1968, the legal system became involved through the efforts of the PARC, the Pennsylvania Association for Then Retarded Children, now just PARC, that lawsuit began. And the first point on this slide is it was about education, the first lawsuit, because most people were sent to institutions because they weren't allowed in public school. So if you close the front door and allow children with any disability to go to public school, then we don't need the institutions. That was the theory, and that was the first great victory, the right to education. That became idea, federal law, and now it's the law of the land. The second was not in sequence, but Nicholas Romeo lived at Pennhurst, and he was so horribly abused that he was kept, for example, in restraints for months at a time. His case went to the Supreme Court and established a variety of right to treatment based on professional judgment. And that was new at the time. And third, the right to community was also centered around Pennhurst Center. Haldeman versus Pennhurst was about people who were institutionalized unjustly in horribly inhumane conditions. And that in the federal court in Philadelphia was decided in favor of the plaintiffs, and that began a really a wildfire of lawsuits across the United States. I'm smiling because it really took hold. And 17 states very quickly copied the Pennhurst suit and began actions. So it was really litigation that got us going. All of these litigations lent impetus to the Medicaid waiver permission in the community of 1981. All of this helped lead to the ADA in 1990, the Olmstead decision in 1999, and the United Nations CRPD in 2006 on the rights of persons with disabilities. Now we have about 18, almost 19 states with nobody with an intellectual disability in a public institution. That's coming pretty far. Footnote, Pennhurst, Pennsylvania, we still have 4. Connecticut, Southbury, that was the subject of a 60 Minutes piece, 1996. There's still about 100 people there. So we're not done, but the numbers are way down. How do we remember things? Well, one way is a historic marker. Our little group in Pennsylvania did that about Pennhurst, and that's a Pennhurst class member looking up at the sign, which was unveiled, by the way, by Tom Gilhol and that person. So the Pennhurst memorialization began in about 2010. Other ways to remember, our little group, Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, began in 2008. We had that historic marker in 2010, and we created a traveling exhibit, videos, documentaries, and speaking all over the place, way too much than anyone wanted. We put together 2 books and individual stories. These are the things that make people pay attention. Roland Johnson was one of the graduates of Pennhurst, and he's being memorialized again and again now. In fact, we're thinking about a statue in Philadelphia right now. So, and there's a book being worked on. And at Pennhurst, which has a sordid past and a sordid recent past of being a haunted house. I just let that sink in for a second. Our group fought that. This is the only person I know who ticketed to shut that thing down, Judy Gran. But it's still there, and they're making money hand over fist. But after 10 years, we actually got new owners who removed the backstory and most of the demeaning imagery about people with intellectual disabilities. I can't stop myself from making a footnote. Any haunted house has nuances of disability and mental illness in it. Any movie from Halloween to Psycho, they all have that. There was an ARC in Northern Virginia that ran a Halloween haunted house in an old orphanage, and it couldn't get away from that. Oh, we have an axe murder. So that said, the Pennhurst experience now includes regular tours on Saturday mornings, historic tours. The actors who work in the Halloween attraction largely identify as themselves having disability. And most of them have become really passionate about giving the real history in every chance they get. And there's a working museum at Pennhurst, which is now moving to a larger site with air conditioning and heating. But the initiative, PMPA, was founded in 2009 with 2 goals: create a museum, a place of memory and learning at Pennhurst, and encourage one for the whole United States. Those 2 goals. Once the Pennhurst Museum started operating, we kind of segued to a national mission about 2018. By the way, this is our traveling exhibit in the Senate office building. And there's, since we created a bill to create a national museum, the guy on the right there is Bobby. President Biden recently in his State of the Union talked about Bobby's bill about rising prices. Well, Bobby is Bob Casey, son of Governor Casey of Pennsylvania, and he is our sponsor for the bill to create a national museum. And he's extremely enthusiastic. So our dream is, imagine someday that Americans could take people, including their children, to a place of memory and learning that has dignity, honor, and has a future mission of making things better. And for folks who can't go in person, a virtual experience absolutely got to be the strongest we've ever done. And this is how we can learn to do it. 5 students in Massachusetts visited an old institution and were shocked at how awful it was, and it even looked awful. And they said, well, how come everyone doesn't know about this? Where's the museum? This op-ed appeared in the New York Times. And It was this op-ed, by the way, that Judy Gran and I took with us to show to Judy Heumann at a civil rights gathering in Alabama in 2018, and showed it to her and said, you know, we ought to have a national museum. And Judy said, yeah. So that's how Judy Heumann got involved in the National Museum effort. There are three great achievements in civil rights memorialization in the nation's capital. None of them happened quickly. One of them took over 100 years. Two are moving along. And our bill, the bill to create a commission to study the need for National Museum of Disability History and Culture, has not yet been introduced because we need total bipartisanship, and we haven't gotten that yet. So there is the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum. Took from 1987 to 1993, although most would say it took from World War II to 1993. National Museum of the American Indian is on the mall now. Began in 1989, opened 2004. National Museum of African American History and Culture began in 1915, opened 101 years later. So this won't be quick. Now in progress, but not yet built. The National Museum of the American Latino. A bill was passed during the pandemic to start study of the need for that. The National Women's History Museum. A bill was passed at the same time during the pandemic to start the study of the need for that. And we are moving ahead right now. We have a champion in the Senate, Bob Casey. We have a bill written. It's ready to go. But this must be bipartisan from the start. So we're taking endorsements right now. I'll share this later, but at the bottom of this slide is the name of the person in Bob Casey's office who wants to take organizational endorsements right now. Allison Hernandez and Bob Casey are with us. And please join us in a noble effort.
Okay, great. Next, we'll hear from Kate Jurek, Dr. Kate, who will be appearing virtually. She wasn't able to attend in person because her mother, who was planning to support her in traveling from Minnesota to Washington, had surgery recently and is not able to travel. So Kate will give her presentation with an AAC device, and the text will also appear on the screen. And my favorite speech therapist assures me that research shows that you are able to achieve 90% comprehension of the content when it's presented both verbally and in text. So, Kate. Before Kate begins, I think I want to emphasize how difficult it is to capture the reality of the institutional experience. And that's where I think Kate has an enormous contribution to make as a person with disability who was institutionalized. It's all very well and very important to preserve artifacts and archives and display them. But how to convey the reality of the institutional experience is a tremendous challenge, because in a way, it's the absence of life, of our everyday life that unfolds from day to day. And great authors have struggled to convey this kind of emptiness. One of the best is Toni Morrison, the late Toni Morrison, who has written about how challenging it was to write her first novel, The Bluest Eye, because it dealt with the destruction of self for a young Black girl. And she really struggled to give a shape to that. She's written about it and said it's like conveying the emptiness that you hear in the air after a loud boom or a cry. It's like the imprint of a blow. So I think Kate, more than anyone I know, has been able to convey some of this experience. So take it away, Kate.
I think the issue for me when we talk about sites of remembrance and museums about disability is, whose memories are we memorializing? Are we tracking history over time as told by the professionals who left paper trails that let researchers and others follow for one type of history? Are we preserving the memories of families whose loved ones lived in these institutions for people with complex needs? Are we preserving the oral histories of the people who worked in these institutions? How do we tell the stories from the position of those who existed in those places as they left few written or oral records? How are we curating the artifacts that have come out of these institutions? These are vitally important questions because the answers determine the public face of these memorials. For example, this is a picture of a cabinet of toys at Penhest taken by Dr. Nathan Stenberg. To many people, the assumption would be that they are examples of the toys that children played with, or professionals might look at them as objects used for evaluations. As an institutional survivor, I would call them objects of coercion, used by professionals and other staff to coerce a desired outcome. Do this thing and you can play with the toy for a minute or two, but then it will be taken away until you do another task. The toy was never the child's. How do we reconcile the various viewpoints and center the ones of those most impacted? Memories are difficult to make in the everyday sameness of institutional living. And with the constant turnover of staff, who serves as a memory keeper for a person living in an institution? I can say, remember when we went to see the musical Matilda? And my mom and I can share memories. In an institution, I would probably not have gotten to see the musical, and if I did, the person who supervised the outing probably no longer works there or wouldn't think to reminisce about it to one of the group of residents. So how do we memorialize the memories that were never allowed to be made? How do we teach visitors to these memorials about the emptiness of the lives of the people who lived in these institutions? Do we talk about why the dehumanizing occurred? Do we look at the systematic structures in place that perpetuate institutional forms of care, or are the artifacts enough? I commend the work done to close down the institutions. My hope is that your work continues to create places where memories can be made and memory keepers are there to share them. I'm going to use a poem from my book, Living in the Abyss, to help make my point. Ordinary things. It was the ordinary things that slipped my notice. The soft smiles, the gentle touch. The favorite breakfast, the afternoon snack. The bright pink tutu, the superhero cake. The sled rushing down the hill. The regal yellow tulips shining in the morning sun. The curling up with my grandma's Afghan and a storybook. The picnic in the backyard. The fresh raspberries that jumped off the cane and into my mouth. The birthday cake made just for me. The joy of splashing in the puddles under a rainbow. The spontaneous hug just because. The love that wrapped around me because I was me. These things slipped my notice because none of them belonged to me. I had grim faces, utilitarian touch. I had grape jelly sandwiches mixed with smushed green peas. I had third-hand clothes, nothing that was just mine. I was not allowed outside in winter, so I never knew about a sled. I never saw a flower, only worn-away holes where grass used to be. I never had a grandma or a storybook. I never had a picnic. It disrupted the routine. Fresh fruit was not allowed, being too much of a hassle. Nobody ever told me that I had a birthday, so there was nothing to celebrate. Joy was not allowed, huddles being only a nuisance. No one believed in hugs. They were an unnecessary aberration. Love was nowhere, non-existent, and definitely not to be wasted on me. All these ordinary things that people take for granted never existed in my world. The implicit understanding of how the world was never mine, was unknowable, as unattainable as touching a star. Yet there exists the expectation that I know these ordinary, wondrous things. That we speak the same language of memory. That our experiences mirror each other's. Without the realization that my mirror was shattered years ago. I have no magic potion to reconstruct your mental juxtapositions, as your brain cannot conceive of a world devoid of ordinary things. So we pass as strangers a great ravine between us. For you believe with no reservations that it is my job to understand ordinary things. But I have no words for things I do not know. One of the things I wish for in a museum or site of remembrance is a room of photos of memories that never got made. A birthday party with the image of the person behind the cake blurred out. A swing on a playground with the person blurred out. A personalized bedroom with the person blurred out. And on and on and on.
Thanks, Kate. That is going to be a real challenge. I love the idea of a place in the museum showing the memories that never were. So finally, Catherine Ott will hopefully tie this all together.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes, aloha. Thank you, Judy, for inviting me. Thank you, Tash. Thank you. Hi, Dr. Kate. Thank you, Jim, for agreeing to be on here with me. And thank you to the captioner. And thank you to all of you who came inside on such a gorgeous fall afternoon to be together and think about these things. I am light-skinned with silver shoulder-length hair, have lots of laugh lines. I'm wearing a gray jacket and black shirt. I also have pants on, but you can't see them. I have education status. I have citizenship status. I am typically abled. I was raised white. And for pronouns, you can pronoun me any way you want, baby. It's all good. A couple of introductory thoughts to give you an idea of where I am coming from. I'm not a lawyer, so my mind may move in mysterious ways compared to the way your minds do, so I'm aware of that. I'm a museum curator and historian. I spend much of my energy trying to understand material culture, where it is, who has it, that's objects. You know, why it's there, why does any of this matter, how can we share it with others? The Division of Medicine and Science at the Smithsonian Museum, where I work, manages the largest and most significant collection of health-related artifacts in the Western Hemisphere. I know that I am in a very privileged position, and we have rich collections, and that also comes with it a responsibility to the others who are not at the table, who will never be at the table, but that's who we study, we leverage, we hold up, and we cherish. I've been building the disability collections at the museum for 20-some years, starting with the rehabilitation objects that my predecessor brought in. So I cold call strangers and ask if I can pick their brain, or would they part with something they own and they love a lot. I examine what we already have in the national collections with new questions about disability. I am also regularly schooled and patiently corrected by people with lived experience who are kind enough to share what they know with me, because I didn't live it. So they tell me, and I also know how to shut up and listen. The objects all come with stories. Objects have a magic to them. They carry the lives of other people into our lives. Objects have a unique kind of animism. They communicate to us and are this tangle of makers, materials, owners, users, eras, and they're continually threatened by disintegration and extinction. And I get paid to think about all this, pretty sweet gig, right? I have a very complicated relationship with objects and museums. Museums were grounded in colonialism and still are very heavily in colonialism. But I have had years of being alone with things in storage areas, following visitors around the gallery and eavesdropping on their conversations. I was there on your last visit and you didn't even know it. A side note, I swear I have never tried to try on the First Lady's dresses. They wouldn't fit me anyway, so. Cultural shifts in interpretation of concepts and language related to diagnosis, trauma, disability, mental health, body integrity, sexuality. It makes my work exciting, but also a little scary and intimidating and confusing and humbling. For example, in 1977, the museum mounted an exhibition named Triumph Over Disability. It perfectly captured the takeaway message of the time, but for us, it's pretty cringy. And the text was pretty cringy at every level. Judith asked how we should remember and memorialize institutionalized people. She sent us a couple questions to help us think about what to talk about. Well, the first thing is the people who are or have been institutionalized are the ones who need to lead the discussion, for sure. Using museums and their objects to retrieve history and people's experiences in tales of formidable and ever-present destroying angel, objectification. Objectification is constant and unavoidable. It can happen easily when you're studying people, especially people who are not like you, who have a lived experience really different from yours. And who am I to say what it has meant in the past to be a person with disability or a person of color or even a man? I've read about men in books. My father was a man. But who am I to assume I know what anyone else has experienced? Objectification is inherent in our very apprehension of the world. And it's what we do at museums. It's what you do when you study in a classroom, when you read about other people. An area in which objects are intensely attractive, but objectification becomes a trap is museums and public history. Among human populations, people with disabilities, people of color, poor people, people marginalized for whatever reason, have an enduring history of oppression. And it's yet to be really acknowledged or well integrated into common scholarship or mainstream comprehension. And as a consequence, the acceptance of speaking for others undermines, or at least skews, what I do and what most of us do who don't have that lived experience. There are real ethical issues related to this. Paternalism, the act of speaking for others, defining others. There's great power in creating categories, circumscribing possibilities, and imposing the will of those with authority to define and categorize. The earlier panel was talking about this, the dangers of it. Jim was talking about it, Dr. Kate was. Should such concepts about people be understandable and accessible to those who are theorized about? This is language justice at its base. There is an especially important question for people who have historically been spoken about and spoken for, but seldom had the opportunity to represent themselves. People who communicate with signs and gestures, or who do not formulate sentences and concepts in ways that are acceptable or understandable to their family, beyond their family or their community, nonetheless have a righteous claim on the legitimacy of what is said about them and how such statements are deployed. The history of disability includes many struggles by many groups and individuals like People First, self-advocates, the psych survivor group, to make professionals accountable for the theories created about them. Bodies that are unmodulated in movement, in speech or thought, those that cause a scene or bring attention to themselves because they do not fulfill our standards of etiquette, those bodies are really hard to recover. Historical documentation of people in motion, especially bodies that move in unconventional ways, it barely exists, and only really since cinema came on the scene not that long ago. As a historian, I can say that. Literary description is highly mediated, subjective, and often larded with stigmatizing language and adjectives. Objects can help restore that lost knowledge, the heft of a prosthetic limb, the rigidity of a brace, like a Milwaukee brace, which was popular back in polio times, the lack of cushioning on wheelchair wheels, the size and shape of an ear trumpet, a boot with 4-inch soles on it. Such objects document movement, as well as the politics and economics of the time. Exclusion of people and their stuff, their existence, is a major hurdle. So how do we find people who left few records? People who were not valued, often locked away in institutions or in their homes, their lives erased or turned to dust before leaving a trace. There are ways to find them if you have the patience and the motivation, through close examination, through imagination, hanging out with living people and their stuff, talking to them, because objects help us recover the physical presence of humans and other beings by engaging through the senses and forcing you to move into your own body and share space with other bodies. I'm talking about embodied knowledge. That's what objects give us, and it's really receded a lot in modern life because we're on screens or we're watching rather than being and touching. Embodied knowledge is sometimes called intuition, or the hunch you have about something, or you just feeling, and we really undervalue it. But objects and the museums that take care of them are a superhighway to the past, to life, to other people. It goes because objects and the sensory data you get from them goes right into your body, your heart, your brain, not mediated by language usually. And that's the highway that many institutionalized people use for communicating what is going on with them, what they feel, and how they manage to communicate it. You can find lost people and get hints through their objects, the wear patterns, the evidence of use. There, on a mouth gag, you can see bite marks. We have one that's a wooden one in our collection that's really powerful to think about. How something was made, the graffiti on walls, the contents of a confiscated suitcase or a whole room full of suitcases if you're in New York. And what do we want people to know about all this? I think resistance is a key word that should be wound through all of this. People with disabilities are notoriously bad at fitting in. They have been at the rebellious forefront of asserting that difference is fundamental to everything on the planet. Resistance is mandatory when the world is not designed for you. Thank you. Yes. Resistance takes many forms. It can be overt, indirect, passive, adjacent. Resilience is also a powerful form of resistance and essential if you're different. But a side note about resilience is that it takes attention away from who or what is causing the harm and the damage. It lets the abuser off the hook. Oh, see how resilient they are? They're going to be okay. They're resilient, which really diffuses resistance. And disability is relational. It is about relationships grounded in community, chosen and often not chosen community. The exchanges within the relationships are where people come into being. And very often the nature of the relationship is one of resistance. Identity is not found in a medical transcription or a diagnostic manual or a patient record full of tests and client ADLs, like activities of daily living. That's where the naming power is, but that is not where the people are. Human relationships are established and mediated through objects, architecture, assistive devices, media, clothing, food, where the buttons are, technology, and all the other stuff that surrounds us. The artifacts owned and used by people with disabilities, as well as those that were used upon them or that they encountered in life, create possibilities, impose limits, assert political and ideological positions, and shape identity. As the three-dimensional sensory zone of reality, material culture emerges from the psychic matrix. I swear this sentence made sense when I wrote it, so I'm not even going to finish it. I lost the plot on that one. In other words, a person who uses a rigid white pole to navigate the sidewalk or some version of serotonin uptake in order to make and sustain friendships is immersed in cultural formations of urban design, of impairment, of chemistry and material science and community. It's all there in whatever somebody's using and needing and owning. In short, how we talk about and understand people with disabilities or anyone who is not like us really requires a lot of vigilance and a lot of sharing of power. And this problem has no satisfying resolution. It's immensely messy. I'm just saying, there's no one answer, and there's never going to be any good answer. So what is being done? The last thing I want to touch on. We are certainly living with injustices that are hundreds of years old. And there are many people who support the discredited methods and concepts that have grown out of that. The general public perception of where disabled people are even is deceptive. Institutionalization still exists on a mass scale, but it's largely invisible to most of us. The totalizing institutions, to use Irving Goffman's old term, are still thriving and still numerous, but they're even further removed from public scrutiny. We use prisons for that purpose. Prison hospitals are pretty much worlds unto themselves, and that's where many, many people go. Right out of high school, sometimes they get kicked out of high school and go to prison soon. There are a lot of statistics. I know Jim knows this stuff. Actually, there are more people with disabilities who are institutionalized now than ever before. They're in prisons. So what I've been getting at from a couple of different directions is why work in museums, in the arts, and the humanities is so important, because it realigns emphasis by helping to restore the agency and the presence of those who did not leave traditional archival evidence. Understanding the past and other people through the past is one of the best ways to get us to a future where everyone is cared for. I'm talking about the work of institutions, of former institutions made into historic sites, reclaiming sites in cemeteries like Penhurst is doing, saving oral histories, collecting objects and papers and photographs along with the information about them before things get tossed and destroyed and the people pass from our knowledge and from the planet. There are a lot of places getting a critical second look. There are listservs who are behind this and working on it, where young people are, pop-ups, documentaries, feature-length productions, music, historical markers, like you showed, that keep the record alive for everyone who's passing by. There is something important that happened here. And even the simple act of taking the time to listen to someone's story is a worthy endeavor. There's a lot of work to be done, and I'm really happy and excited to be part of it. So, yeah.
Before we open it up for questions, I just want to say I really appreciate Catherine's insight that the roots of the Museum of Material Culture lie in colonialism. And I think that's tremendously important for us because the institution is similar in that it's a society set apart, different from the metropole, if you will, where people who are classified as other and maybe kind of threatening to the larger society are subjugated by the majority culture. And I think that has to always be borne in mind when we present the history of the institution in a museum. And I just wondered, Catherine, how you would respond to the challenge that Kate posed when she talked about this display case in the museum at Penhurst that shows toys that were played with in the institution. And it looks very benign. And a typical person, you know, walking by that is going to say, oh, how nice. They had toys to play with. And as Kate pointed out, those were actually objects of coercion and control of the people who lived there. So how to explain to the public?
Yeah, I made a note of that. Thank you, Dr. K, for that shift in frame. That's where people who lived it are so important to understanding. Years ago, I collected, because a lot of closed institutions, even currently ones, would have a little showcase with things they collected from inmates. And well, see, there that gives me away. So I got some keys that were homemade from found materials that were confiscated. And I sent the deed of gift to the institution in Wisconsin. I said 3 keys made by inmates. And they signed it, wrote it back. They crossed out inmates and wrote patients, which is part, and some would have maybe more recently consumers, they would have maybe said. So, and that really captures how you need different people explaining what happened. And I give, as a historian, I give grace to people who lived 150 years ago and did bad things. I want to think they were doing the best they could with what they had and what they knew. Even in institutions that are under-resourced, there are people trying to do the best they can. But that's why we need Dr. Kate and others who lived it to correct that record. So that is what leads when people see an object, that's what they know first. And then the revisions or what came before is also part of the history.
Great panel, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to seeing the museum when it opens. Can you hear me now? great panel, and I look forward to seeing a museum when it opens someday. My question is, are you talking about public institutions or private institutions? And I'm asking because I don't know whether my parents would ever think of me as going into a private institution, but and I have done a lot of thinking about this recently. But but I people might not have called where I live an institution, but I think of it as an institution. So, and we can't forget about the private institutions. So,
Like to respond to that?
I would. That's really great. Most of the work that I got to do was about public institutions, almost all of it. And yet, you know, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people still live in the private institutions. So that is a future frontier for litigation, in my opinion.
So this is Catherine. What I was thinking, which may not answer your question, but what came to mind was Audre Lorde, I think, wrote about how just leaving your home is an act of resistance, of affirmation that you are there and you matter. And whether the institution, if you think of it as an institution, it is. And you use things, use forks and knives and whatever, wherever you are, to sustain yourself. And hearing from other people who have a different take on what that means is really important for all of us to understand how complicated and important everyone's life is. So.
So, just relating more to that, I live in Illinois. And we have many institutions, including public and private institutions, where all those things that you're saying that happen in the public institutions are happening 3 times more in the private places there as institutions grow. And I was wondering if there was more strategical ways that people with disabilities can get involved in supporting like museums and negotiations and getting lawsuits against to close these places when you have the parents organization, the National Parents Organization living in your backyard, their headquarters. And you have very public union workers in the state, and not very many providers or other people willing to step up to get those places closed. I mean, that's what I was gonna ask the other parents, can you please come to Illinois?
This is Jim. I again refer to the earlier panel about cross-disability litigation, because that even the private institutions now to get public funds. So it's time. Back when we started in the 70s, there were public institutions were the low-hanging fruit. We could sue them easily. And now it's much more difficult, but that is the future of litigation. The private institutions are everywhere. And so much is going on in the nursing homes because, well, the boomers are getting old. Now suddenly it's important to us.
Well, Catherine, I don't have anything, but I bet Dr. Kate does.
Yeah, Kate,
But-
Kate, do you have anything to respond to that?
I'm a slow typist, so I may let my mom answer for me, but don't worry. I'll call her out if she gets it wrong.
Kate was in a private institution that was run as for profit. That's where I met her. She's adopted, which is why she was able to make a lot of the changes and end up getting a PhD, is she didn't live there. I worked there, that's where I met her. One of the unit supervisors who I met 10 years later told me that she still had nightmares about the place. So somebody that could come and go was having nightmares. What people who had to live there were going through, I think, is pretty awful. And from what Kate's had to work through, I know it's pretty awful.
Thanks. And that's, by the way, Barb Jurek, Kate's mother, who just spoke. One thing I've noticed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which are both states that have a lot of private institutions and where there is a tradition of segregated education for kids with disabilities. I looked at some statistics from a school district in Pennsylvania, Lower Merion. That's where Jim sent his kids to school. It's a very wealthy school district that has a significant population of African Americans for historical reasons. And I noticed that the kids, the white kids were very often diagnosed with autism. The African American kids were diagnosed as having learning disabilities or behavioral disorders. Apparently, they have found a cure for autism in the African American community in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. But the kids with autism went through school and they would typically be sent to private schools, and they would, as adults, transition to a private institution for adults with disabilities, or maybe just stay in the same institution throughout life. And of course, we all know about the school to prison pipeline. That was much more characteristic of the African American special education students. So I think we have to look at some of those cultural dynamics that contribute to this pattern of private institutionalization, which is huge and largely invisible.
Well, thank you, Judith. That brings us to 3:30. In order to give folks an opportunity for a break and to get ready with our third fabulous panel this afternoon, if you have additional questions, again, please find our excellent panelists. If you join me in giving them a round of applause. So please find them during the break. Our third panel will get started at 3:45. See you then.